For this example project, we have 3 Eloquent models: user, project, and article. So let's now talk about the relationship between those models, which is very important. For example, user and article. What's the connection there? What pieces them together? Well, you might say a user can create articles. Sure. But you could also say a user has articles. So imagine somewhere in your code base you have a user instance and you want to access all of the articles from that specific user. Ideally, we might do something like this. Give me the current user's articles. Okay, so we know we probably need an articles method on user, and we'll hold that thought. Okay, well, what about the inverse? If we have an article, so the inverse would be if I have an article instance and I want to grab the user who wrote it, maybe I could do this. Give me the user. All right, so once again, we need a user relationship. All right, one more, or maybe 2. What about a project and a user? Well, presumably, a user can create any number of projects. So same thing. Give me the user's projects. All right. A user can have many projects. And for the inverse, a project belongs to a user. That's the relationship we want. So we'll add a user method. Okay, so when we are working with Eloquent, we can define these relationships in a nice, readable way. Like this. If a project belongs to a user, I could say this belongs to, and then we reference the associated model, user. Really nice. A project belongs to a user. So now think about it. If you have a project instance and you access user, now on that note, notice that I'm referencing user as a property and not a method. This can be a little tricky at first, but stick around. At least for now, know that when you call user as a property, you're still ultimately calling this method. Now anyways, when we call this method, ultimately what's happening is this is being translated into the appropriate SQL query. Or in other words, something like select star from user where the project ID equals the ID of the current project. Something along those lines. Okay, let's keep going. If I go to user and we've decided a user can have many articles and many projects, once again, return this has many articles. And then the same thing down here. A user can have many projects. Now, in the case of a has many relationship, ultimately the SQL query that's going to be executed, in this case would be something like select star from articles where the user ID, again, equals the ID of the current user instance. So if your user instance has an ID of 1, you're doing something like this. Give me all the articles scoped to this user alone. And then the same would be true here. Select star from projects where the user ID is 1. So what we see here is if we're going to make this work, on your project table, you need to have a user ID column. And that creates the link between the project and the user. And the same is going to be true up here for articles. In order for this link to work, your articles table needs to have a user ID column. So now, if you were to put this into motion, if you were to say something like, give me the user with an ID of 1, that's going to execute a query like this. Select star from user where the ID is 1. Okay. Next, if you were to say, give me the user's projects, like we discussed, that's now going to execute a second query like this. We have a user with an ID of 1, so now select all projects where the user ID is basically that. This query will then be returned as a collection and then assigned to this project's property. So now when you access user projects, and don't worry, we're going to review this with real examples in the next episode. But anyways, now when you access this project's property, you have what we call an Eloquent collection. You have a collection of projects that you can then iterate over. You could grab the first project. You could grab the last project. You could find a specific project that meets some kind of criteria. You could split all the projects into multiple groups. You could group the projects. There's all sorts of functionality you can reach for when you have a collection. And don't worry, we'll dedicate a full chapter to that. Okay, so we're starting to learn our first relationships. One is has many. One model can have many of another model. The inverse of that is belongs to. A project belongs to a user. Maybe a task, a to-do item, belongs to a project. A comment belongs to an article. You get the distinction there. Now, in addition to those two, you have things like has one. A user has one profile. We have has many. A user has many articles, has many projects, has many tasks, has many tweets, anything like that. You've learned belongs to. And really, these three are going to take you a long, long way. But you also have some slightly more complicated ones when you're dealing with things like pivot tables. And that would be belongs to many. Or even when you're dealing with polymorphic relationships, morph many or morph to many. Those are probably the most complex or I would say confusing relationships to understand. But yeah, you can reach for those when you need them. Otherwise, I promise you, these 3 or 4 are going to take you a very long way. So in the next episode, we'll open up the console and review how these relationships work and how we fetch the associated records.